Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome, everyone, to Education South Asia seminar. And as many of you might already know, for last couple of years, we've been running a series of seminar on the theme of education and South Asia. And we've been taking these conversations forward through Education South Asia Network, which is a collaborative platform for discussions around various issues related to education and South Asia. So please do sign up for our mailing list, and we'll keep you updated on our activities. And in this term, we are very pleased to host the seminar as a collaborative project of University of Oxford, Indocs, India Oxford Initiative, and IOE UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. And for today's session, we are very delighted to have Professor Akshay Mangla to talk to us about his a new book titled Making Bureaucracy Work, Norms, Education and Public Service Delivery in Rural India. And Professor Mangla is an associate professor at Said Business School, University of Oxford, and the book investigates when and how public agencies deliver primary education across rural India. So we are presenting today's seminar as a conversation between Professor Mangla and Mohini Gupta. So very warm welcome to Education South Asia seminar, Professor Mangla, and thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really looking forward to learning more about your work and your book. I would now like to hand over to Mohini to start the session.
Thank you so much, Uma, and welcome, Professor Mangla. Thank you so much for doing this with us. So congratulations on your new book, Making Bureaucracy Work, Norms, Education and Public Service Delivery in Rural India. We're really looking forward to hearing more about it. So I'm just going to jump right into the conversation and maybe ask you to share a little bit about what really motivated you to write this book. Just tell us a little more about the book. What are the key messages in the book? What are the key issues that you address? And then we'll talk about some of those issues in detail. So over to you.
Thank you. And thanks, Uma, and thanks, Mohini, for arranging this talk. And I appreciate everyone here in the audience. There's a vibrant community of researchers, students interested in issues of education in South Asia, and I'm really happy to be part of that conversation. So just getting to the book, why this book and, what are its messages? Just taking a step back, I think one of the motivations in writing a book on education and bureaucracy is that actually to understand how services get delivered, it's quite difficult to understand that process without having a sense for the implementing agencies in charge of delivering those services. So there's a vast literature that I had consulted in the comparative politics of education. And that work has taught us many things about differences in, for example, the level of spending on education between countries. It's also told us about differences in the formal laws and the design of education policies, again, often cross-nationally. There was a lot less written, I found, in terms of how policies get implemented on the ground. And that could be a gap owing to the fact that there's less, you could say, a field-based research looking at the implementing agencies, but also in terms of understanding how a national policy gets implemented. One can draw on subnational comparisons, and that is also a methodological approach I'm happy to talk about, which one finds has become increasingly used in comparative politics, but it hasn't kind of filtered yet into the comparative politics of education. So part of the motivation of the book is to kind of move us from looking only at spending and policy design, which is really important, to getting us to look at implementation. And when you look at the vast differences in the quality of services, not just in India, but across countries and within countries, understanding that implementation challenge is front and center, I think. So a bit about what the key messages are in the book. So I'll be happy to kind of go into the details, I guess, of the research and the core findings. But essentially what I observe is that we have in India a national program for education that's been ongoing for the better part of 20 years now. And we see that there's a similar set of policies set by the center, and they're very similar formal institutions implementing those policies. So the design of institutions is quite similar. But what I observe are real robust differences in the informal norms that guide how public officials understand their duties and execute those policies on the ground. So a key message of the book is to, one, move beyond just the formal design of institutions, but look at the content of the norms that guide how officials actually understand their duties and in the process relate to citizens in implementation. And what I do in the book is theorize two very distinct sets of norms that I observe coexisting within India. On the one hand, you find some agencies take a much more, you could say, legalistic approach to the delivery of education. And legalism draws from a long literature on bureaucracy, which is really about following the letter of the law, upholding policy rules, protecting hierarchy, and preventing societal interference and preventing capture of bureaucracy. On the other hand, I observe a very different model of bureaucracy, which I refer to as a model that's far more deliberative. So there's a lot written about theories of deliberation and democratic politics, but less so on deliberation and the politics of bureaucracy. And deliberation in a bureaucracy is much more about participation in decision-making, problem-solving orientations, and as a consequence, you get a much more, you could say, flexible approach to thinking about the rules. And essentially what I find is that these two different forms of bureaucracy have very different consequences for implementation. While legalistic bureaucracies are very good at rule compliance, and as a consequence, they can implement certain less complex features of policy, like implementing the construction of schools or ensuring enrollment. They're far less effective in those areas that are more complex and require societal coordination. So ensuring, for instance, regular student attendance or the quality of teaching and monitoring of those schools. By contrast, I find agencies that are more deliberative are far better at incorporating local input into decision-making. And as a consequence, they can adapt policies to local needs much more effectively. They're more likely to get community buy-in. And as a consequence, one observes higher quality education services. And I'm happy to sort of unpack all that in the course of our conversation. But these are the really big differences I observe linking norms to variation in the implementation of education. I would say another key message of the book is that actually when we think about policy implementation and service delivery, there's a tendency to think that services are simply rendered or delivered by the state. But there's actually a vast literature on co-production following Elinor Ostrom and others who've taught us that actually policies aren't just delivered, they're co-produced with citizens. And when you look at a policy like education, it's almost impossible to think about a school functioning well without community input. I mean, the very fact that children sit in a classroom and participate in the process of education should alert us to the fact that they're also participants in the co-production of education. And so what I try to show in the book is that these differences in bureaucratic norms, not only do they stimulate differences in the behavior of state officials, but these differences in bureaucratic behavior have knock-on effects on how citizens experience the state and their likelihood in participating in decision-making. Local collective action around schooling can vary. And so in some sense, when we think about these sort of local level agencies that are implementing education, not only are they impacting implementation, they're actually shaping the very practice of citizenship at the local level. And I think that's a bigger research theme that we would want to elaborate on, which is that the sort of everyday public administration of services also impacts how citizens see the state, the relationship to it, and whether they think their participation is effective or not. And I, again, will be happy to unpack that through some examples in the book. But I think those are the broad themes that I try to push forward. And, in some sense, this is taking us down to the ground in terms of implementation and allowing us to see that actually the everyday politics of implementation is actually a site of politics that really impacts social welfare, impacts ideas of citizenship, and more largely the capacity of the state actually to deliver on its promises.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Professor Mangla. And I think we will get into sort of the details of the two bureaucratic models that you were talking about. I would really like to know more from your experience, what you really saw on ground. But before that, maybe we could talk a little bit about your research methodology as well. I'm really interested to know how you sort of went about your fieldwork. I know that this book sort of covers about 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork that you conducted. So just tell us a little bit about how you collected your data, and then we can go into some of the case studies that you mention in the book as well.
Yeah, happy to. I think taking a step back before I get into methodology, I might say a few words about my research design, because I think in trying to understand something as complex as implementation, one has to think about what are the range of factors that could possibly drive implementation. And here, again, I consulted a large literature on public goods, social service delivery, in India and elsewhere. And while this literature taught us many things, I think it had some gaps. So for one, the literature, at least from India and looking at South Asia more broadly, has often drawn sharp distinctions across geographic regions. So the distinction between South India and North India. So coastal states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu seen as far better in terms of social services, not just education, but also public health and other areas, in comparison to, say, the less well-performing states in the Hindi belt of North India. And these sort of subnational comparative studies have taught us very much about the importance of, say, social movements in the South, particularly around caste, but also around gender and class. In the North, these movements didn't obtain as much, yet there's really vast variation in the delivery of education and the outcomes that one observes even within North India. So my research design wanted to make sense of that variation in a region that's often painted as uniformly backward. In fact, if you dig in, there's quite a lot of variation within North India. That was one thing. The other thing was that, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, I wanted to understand how the state interfaces with society, and things like caste composition, gender norms really mattered. And again, one observes lots of differences, not just between North and South, but also within North India. So I selected states where I could try to hold certain factors constant, and then also try to compare and contrast to get at the mechanisms of service delivery in a much more, you could say, analytically robust way. So I have 4 states in the study: Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, and then I have in the Gangetic Plains, I have the state of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And very importantly, I also selected districts that could match. So for instance, in Himachal Pradesh, I selected Shimla and Almora district. In Uttarakhand, these states have a colonial history of British rule. They also have a history of military recruitment from these districts. And if you think about the demand side of education, one reason why you might seek education is to get a job in government or to get a job, say, in the army. And that was actually happening in these districts. So the kind of effort to pair comparisons in a theoretically robust fashion also traveled down to the local level, even when I selected villages. That's a bit about research design. Now, you asked about methods. So again, implementation isn't a process that happens just at one level. And I think looking at existing studies, studies show us important differences across villages. You could see differences across districts. You could see differences across states. What I try to do is map the process of implementation from a state capital down to a rural district, all the way down to a village primary school. And that involved doing ethnographic fieldwork that was comparative in some sense. So I try to, at different levels of the state, understand how policies are being understood by state officials and how they're getting translated at each level. And in fact, at each level, policy undergoes a change. So what the policymaker in New Delhi has in mind about what education is can vary from what the policymaker, say, in Lucknow or in Shimla has in mind, which then can also be different from what the policy implementer down at the local level will have in mind. And so I try to trace this process using a mix of participant observation inside the education bureaucracy, all the way down to interviews with school teachers, with parents, focus group discussions with community groups. So in my book, actually, women's associations play a major role in school governance. And I try to understand how these actors relate to other formal institutions like the village panchayat or village education committees that are stipulated by government policy. And so I try to get both a, you could say, top-down view of implementation from the state planner's perspective and a bottom-up perspective from the citizen seeking those services, and try to understand how these connect, or maybe there's a disconnect between them. And so I try to use multiple methods to get at this. It's very difficult to study implementation up close. And I think for me, multiple data sources were important. So triangulating across sources between interviews, focus group discussions, participant observation, but also triangulating across respondents. So ensuring that I had a balance of perspectives with regards to, say, gender, with regards to social class and caste as well was very important. And so having these multiple methods and multiple sources of data helped me arrive at a much, you could say, more convincing, at least to me, more convincing argument about whether or not norms are having an effect on implementation.
Thank you. There's so many sort of more questions I have based on what you said, but we'll just go one by one. So in terms of, you talked about the 4 states that you're focused on, but I want to sort of look at the 2 Himalayan states that you mentioned. So Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. And your book sort of examines differences in how education is delivered in these states. And of course, both of these states are remote, hilly states. They both sort of face similar kind of socioeconomic challenges in some sense, but there are very different outcomes in terms of primary education, as you've shown. So can you tell us a little bit about how the sort of bureaucratic norms in these states vary and how those shape the implementation patterns in both of these states in particular?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So I think in drawing out this comparison, it's helpful to take also an historical perspective in thinking about how is it that these states were even formed and what was motivating state formation. And if you look at the history of these 2 states, it's interesting that at the time of independence, Himachal Pradesh, the districts that comprise Himachal Pradesh collectively were considered among the worst performing in the country. So if you look at the bottom 5 states or regions for education, Himachal Pradesh was among them at the time of independence. Himachal Pradesh didn't become a state until 71, and you don't really start to notice improvements, like real improvements in education in Himachal Pradesh until maybe 2 decades after that. And so I found that puzzling. And then you look at Uttarakhand, actually some districts like Almora district were among the highest literacy districts in the country. And then you almost see a kind of reversion where you see Uttarakhand getting overtaken by Himachal Pradesh. So I found that sort of on the outcome side puzzling, but then getting to the sort of underlying mechanisms in place, what I observed in Himachal Pradesh was a process whereby the state was seeking support from non-state actors in trying to understand how to implement policy across a vast and challenging geography. So these 2 states are very interesting to study from the perspective of state capacity, because we tend to think hilly areas are not governed as well. There's a vast literature in social sciences that say that states tend to be weaker in these hilly areas because the state cannot penetrate society. It's very difficult, it's costly, and so on to administer education. In the case of Himachal Pradesh, this engagement, this deliberation that took place with non-state actors, and this included civil society groups, it included school teachers, it included women's associations, allowed the state to get information about differences at the local level and tried to identify ways to address those differences. And I'll give you one example that I discuss in the book, which is the academic calendar for examinations. So across India, there's often a uniform calendar within states when final examinations take place. This could be April and May in that period. And this happens to coincide in some places with the harvest season. And what happens is that children who come from agricultural families and disadvantaged backgrounds tend to be helping their families on the farm at those moments. So in some sense, the timing of exams is setting these children up to fail. Often they'll be missing school during those critical months in the lead up to the examinations. Now, in the process of these informal meetings with civil society groups, with local level associations, state planners in Himachal Pradesh learned about these differences. And in different districts in Himachal Pradesh, the harvest can happen at different times. And weather patterns also vary, when schools can be closed for extended periods of time owing to, say, the snow and the winter season. So what the policymakers did was experiment. Let's give districts an opportunity to decide based on their local weather conditions and agricultural harvest patterns, the best time of year to hold the examinations. And that flexibility allowed districts to achieve better results in terms of getting students to participate in those critical months leading up to the exam. And as a consequence, helping students actually perform better on those exams. That's just one example, but I'm happy to talk about more. And in Uttarakhand, it's interesting because in Uttarakhand, there was an attempt to actually copy these policies. So when Uttarakhand broke off from the state of Uttar Pradesh, and in this part of the book, I actually get into the process of how norms end up persisting over time, that this was a moment where one would have thought that maybe Uttarakhand can break away from the state politics in UP, but also break away from the bureaucratic process in UP and carve its own, you could say, approach to governance. And policymakers in Uttarakhand were looking at Himachal Pradesh and thinking and trying to learn and see what aspects of policy in Himachal Pradesh could be adopted for Uttarakhand. And one sees in this period when the state was forming, and I did my fieldwork about a decade later after state formation, so there was a bit of time there to actually incorporate some of those lessons. Instead, what one observes is that state planners were overwhelmingly fearful of giving societal groups that much power over decision making. As a consequence, they wanted to protect the state from societal interference and were much more likely to double down on what I call a more legalistic approach, where they encourage compliance at the local level. In fact, when I talk to administrators in the education bureaucracy, they refer to a policy they call teacher rationalization. They need to do rationalized teachers to ensure that they're teaching in the right districts, not moving around, not trying to seek special exceptions to be, say, transferred to other places. And this kind of discipline filtered down to the local level of the bureaucracy, such that when societal groups would come to the state and seek support in their schools, they found that they were often being turned back. I look at the role of women in women's associations in Uttarakhand. So for those who might not know the history so much, the state of Uttarakhand is also quite important historically in having been the site of a major movement of women around the natural environment. So the Chipko movement and women's associations known in Uttarakhand as these Mahila Mangal Dals played a key role in trying to protect the natural environment. They were also involved in managing natural resources in their villages, and they became engaged in early child education. The state tended to view these as political groups. And because they're political, they're seen as interfering in the state's affairs. And so often kept them at bay and did not provide them the same opportunities to become incorporated in everyday decision-making. And so I trace this process out through a series of case studies at the district and village level, where I show how these groups over time became deterred by local administration and gradually began to exit and encourage exit from the government system and seek private solutions as well. A very different process than what one observed in Himachal Pradesh, where Mahila Mandals in Himachal Pradesh, also these women's associations that emerged organically, were being incorporated into mother-teacher associations by the education bureaucracy. So I talk about in this comparison how that very different set of norms really triggered a different process of societal incorporation, and as a consequence, different outcomes for the quality of education services.
Thank you, Professor Mangla. I have so many questions. I really do want to talk about gender and caste norms that you spoke about as well. But I think before that, we'll just address the models of bureaucracy that you spoke about. And there is Max Weber and his idea of a rational legal state. So I also wanted to ask you what you think Weber and his disciples get wrong or don't fully understand maybe about bureaucratic organizations, because you do talk a lot about sort of response to local needs and adapting to local contexts. And one of the examples examples I think that you've mentioned is Uttarakhand Seva Nidhi and their, for example, their Balwadi program, which was really successful. But then because of their sort of legalistic approach, they had to sort of adhere to those rules. And now that's completely collapsed, that model. So, these two models that you talk about, deliberative and legalistic, how does that sort of fit into the cultural context of the states that you're studying? And how does this book really help us rethink bureaucracy then?
Yeah, so I'll say a bit about Weber. So I would say, if there is a social theorist that haunts me at night, it's probably Max Weber. But the kind of background to this is that when you think about the Weberian state, and the Weberian state is this model of a state that's rule-abiding, is rational, legal, and it achieves this through a series of processes. One is recruitment, ensuring that it's merit-based recruitment, promotion, training, civil service protection. All of these things are supposed to then inculcate a common perspective that's much more about the collective good rather than the private benefits of individual bureaucrats. And I think this core idea of Weber is not necessarily wrong. I think there's been a tendency of scholars to build off of this model of Weberian bureaucracy, extract certain elements from it, and then deploy it across the world. And when a bureaucracy doesn't match that exact, you could say, Weberian model, they're seen as being corrupt or seen as diverging and therefore being weak or incapable or clientelistic or captured. And I think what we're missing here is actually another part of Weber, which is not about necessarily just the formal features of those bureaucracies, but the ethos, what Weber referred to as the norms in that bureaucracy, the culture of bureaucracy. And I think there's a tendency also to think that this culture just comes out on its own. It just emerges out of the process of recruitment and training and civil service protection. But actually, I think the part that I would push is that the norms that emerge in bureaucracies can vary even when you have the same formal design. And that's partly because norms themselves are political constructs. They come out of the politics of state formation, and this can vary across different states. And so in the case of Himachal Pradesh, I talk about the process of Himachal Pradesh's state formation as being a hilly state that was financially unviable, was not as politically central to policymakers in New Delhi and politicians in New Delhi, and really had to fight for its case. And in that process of fighting for its case and getting resources from New Delhi, bureaucrats and politicians at the top had to combine their efforts. So there was a lot more, you could say, cooperation between leadership among senior political leaders and bureaucrats that allowed there to be discussions coming about. And these kept getting reinforced. Every time a negotiation happened with New Delhi, bureaucrats and politicians in Himachal Pradesh had to meet together. When the Finance Commission would come into Himachal Pradesh and see, is the money we're giving Himachal Pradesh being well spent? Again, there had to be a cooperation between these different actors. And this really percolated down the bureaucratic hierarchy. So I talk about in the book, not just looking at the sort of contemporary norms, but understanding their and tracing their political origins and processes. In Uttarakhand, Uttarakhand, in a sense, inherited those norms from Uttar Pradesh. And Uttar Pradesh was politically central. It was seen as the state that you need to win if you want to become prime minister. And we know that's happening even today, right? But as a consequence, politicians and bureaucrats did not necessarily have to combine their efforts in the same ways. In fact, if I'm a bureaucrat, I'm trying to find the best way to become a more senior bureaucrat and enter central administration. I think about rule following as a strategy, and I might end up competing with politicians who are trying to interfere in what I'm doing. And I look at that process after the colonial period and even to the more contemporary period, when you see that underprivileged castes are entering politics, bureaucrats are often responding by trying to double down on legalistic norms, because that is a way to keep society at bay and to retain your authority when you're seeing a change in democratic politics. And so I think this historical process of norm emergence and norm propagation over time is really important. And I think I wouldn't say Weber necessarily got it wrong per se, but I think our reading of Weber is far too thin to make sense of the fact that actually even his own theory allowed for there to be these much more, you could say, qualitative differences across bureaucracies that may appear the same in terms of their formal foundations.
Thank you for that. You have talked also about sort of gender and caste norms in the Himalayas. So I also wanted to understand what you found in terms of their impact on education or the delivery of primary education in particular. How did you see the sort of impact of both of these norms?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. So thanks for asking it, because I think in the literature that I've come across, particularly on education, politics, understanding these nuanced variations in caste and gender norms is often missing. So even when you think about the differences between sweeping differences between some states in South India and those in Northern India, there's a tendency to overlook how norms around caste could be very different, even though there is an appreciation of social movements. How do these play out at the local level? So even in a place like Kerala, where you have seen social movements of caste groups, I find the literature on the everyday norms in schools to be relatively thin in relationship to the sort of macro perspective about the role of these social groups. So I think going down to the nitty-gritty at the village level is really important. And in a sense, that's what also drove me to look at the differences both between the Himalayan states and the Gangetic Plains, but even within the states in the Himalayan region. And I would say caste and gender played a few parts. I mean, for one, thinking about the differences just between the hill region and the plains, big differences in caste composition, big differences in terms of how inclusive or exclusionary caste norms are. So, for example, one finds in the hill region, because upper caste groups are also involved in agriculture, caste and class are less tied together as they are in the plains, where if you're an upper caste, you might be less likely in the plains to be tilling your own soil. You'll be hiring labor to do it. Now, that has also happened in the hills, but the sort of economic distance across caste groups is less, and as a consequence, so could be the social distance. Not to say there isn't a social distance, there certainly is. It's just less steep as it would be in the plains areas. And this makes a big difference, because if you think about it, if you're an underprivileged caste group and you want to participate in, say, a school committee, if you don't feel that you belong in that committee because it's dominated by people who are upper caste, you might decide not to participate. You might not come to the meetings. You might stay silent, or you might get silenced by the upper caste in that area. In the hill region, there's I observed a lot more interdependence across caste groups economically, for example. It's hard to pass through a winter in some of these places without some interdependence across households, and that could also be across caste as well. Gender as well, I've observed very important differences between the two regions, in that women have a far greater role in decision-making in the hill region. Partly that could be to the economic model. Men in many parts of the hill region in India have moved into cities, and there's a remittance-based economy where they could be working in urban areas and sending money back to their native villages. And often it's women who remain in the household, who are participating in decision-making in the household around things like education and possibly in governance as well. So the role of women in panchayats as well plays a different role. Not to say that women aren't playing a major role also in the plains areas. So except the role is different, and it could also be impacted by the more restrictive notions around gender. So one thing I observed in the hills was that women were much more likely to have freedoms to move around, physically move around, go from your village to a block education office, or to go to a meeting of a panchayat, which could be in a faraway village, actually, because a single panchayat might be involving a bunch of different villages. And so you have to move long distances to do that. So that physical mobility became very important. Now, how does this play a role in the actual implementation process? Well, if you want to influence school governance and decision-making, you have to feel confident that your presence and participation as an underprivileged social group, as belonging to a lower caste, or being a woman, that you can overcome that barrier and still have a say in that decision-making. And in some sense, what I find is that bureaucratic norms can either facilitate that process, or it can hinder or encumber that process. So when a bureaucracy encourages more deliberation, it is much more likely to help the underprivileged actors overcome some of those barriers to participation, whereas a bureaucracy that's much more focused on rule compliance and a kind of a protection of hierarchy will tend not to provide that support, and to the contrary, I find that that legalistic bureaucracy, even in Uttarakhand, where the public is very mobilized, it tends to introduce these administrative burdens to participation. So to participate, you have to demonstrate you're a formally recognized group. You have to demonstrate that you have the formal legal authority in the state. So if you're a member of a women's association that informally is participating in decisions in your village, why should we grant you the space to participate in a school committee meeting? These types of battles are being fought at the local level, and the legalistic bureaucracy, I submit, is less capable of actually integrating those disadvantaged groups into decision making. So in some sense, you could think about bureaucratic norms as interacting with social norms at the local level and having divergent impacts on the degree and robustness of local participation.
Thank you so much for the detailed answer. That was really interesting. I do have some policy related questions, but before that, I see some questions on chat, which are also interesting and sort of related to what we've been talking about. So maybe I'll take some of those, and then if we have time, we'll come back to the policy questions. Okay, so there's a question from Nidhi Sabharwal, and she asks, were there any variations across type of schools? So government, private aided and private unaided? And if yes, what were the variations and why?
Right. So thank you for the question. I should say at the outset that my study focused mainly on government schools, and for the reason that the funding for the programs I was examining, which were mainly the midday meal and Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, were mainly directed at government schools. So I didn't look at you could say school level variation by school type as much in this study, and that would be a great area for future research, or existing research in this area has also told us some things. That said, I'll say a couple of things about this. Some differences I observed, because I did actually end up going to private schools, and so you see a lot of private schools mushrooming. I saw some variation between the hills and the plains. So in Uttar Pradesh, for example, one can observe private schools, both aided and unaided, mushrooming up even within a village in different bastis based on the caste community of that basti. And this is quite an important phenomenon for us to track, because when we tend to think of education as this kind of equalizer, but it's also a way to differentiate within society. So in the same village, and I present a case study of a village, Panchal, in Uttar Pradesh, where in the same village there's a government school, there's a private aided school which carries the name of Ambedkar, and it's largely catering to the Chamar subcaste within that village. Then there's another school that was being run informally that was mainly catering towards wealthier, more upper caste members of that same village. And essentially what one observes is that this basically creates a kind of a breaking apart of village collective action. So where you have all these schools coming up in different formats, one finds that actually the collective voice of the community gets weakened, because those who have the most influence in the village have basically exited to the other schools. But even among the less privileged, even among, say, the Dalit community in this same village, one saw a breaking apart, where the Chamar sub-community was sending its children to the Ambedkar private school, and there was a Balmiki sub-community that was sending its children to the government school, because they were seen as different, in fact, schools catering to different groups. So in some sense, what my book tries to also show about that is that the government is actually in sort of applying a sort of uniform policy across different parts of India, may not be taking into account these very nuanced differences in terms of the social composition of the students in these different types of schools. And so that is one piece. The other piece is that you would think that because you have the private schools, you're going to get a lot more effective outcomes. In fact, one sees that even in these private schools, once you control for the social background and the economic background of the household, learning outcomes aren't always that much better. the big difference I observed is that the private schools tend to have teachers for every class, and at least in name, they claim to be English medium. How much English they teach is another matter, but that's something parents find attractive. And so in some sense, the national policies as they're going down are encouraging in some places exit. Because maybe parents are finding that the services are weak, or they're not enough teachers, or they're not teaching enough English education. But I don't have enough in my data to tell you very broadly, these are the differences one observes across these school types, because that wasn't the core of the questions I was asking.
Thank you so much. That was also quite helpful to understand a bit of the landscape. There's also a question around Bihar. So Vanya Lochan has asked, I'm curious to know about your reflections on Bihar, a paradox of a state in terms of its size, caste politics, economics, and also the infamous nature of bureaucracy and politics.
Yeah, so there's many things infamous, I guess, about Bihar, isn't it? I think the case of Bihar entered my study more to understand the prospects for norm change. So when Bihar underwent this transition, and I look at the political history of Bihar and the tumultuous history, actually, and the caste politics and caste violence that took place in the post-colonial period mainly is what I look at. Up into the more recent period, when Nitish Kumar became chief minister, there was a moment when there was a transition towards thinking about good governance as really the responsibility of the state, and a whole lot of policies came up around improving governance. And so this was a moment that many education agencies, including NGOs like Pratham, became involved in education reform. Chief Minister, so the Chief Minister himself would chair committees around education reform. And so it was a moment where one might have thought, now's the time for Bihar to make this transition to better quality public services and better education. Now, one did see some changes take place. And what I argue in the book is that essentially Bihar underwent this transition, not towards a more deliberative state, but one that was actually very clientelistic and very personalistic in its leadership, to one that became a bit more legalistic. So there's pressure on bureaucratic discipline. So very importantly, the chief minister put in place a set of policies to encourage bureaucrats to follow the rules. If bureaucrats were seen to amass a lot of wealth, they were actually publicly shamed, and their assets were actually then going to be appropriated by the state and sent and used for social services. There was also other programs like this program that Chief Minister put in place called this Janta Darbar, which was around the public engaging around education. And then finally, Mission Gunvatta was this policy around quality education. And here, some of the best minds came into Bihar, like people at Poverty Action Lab at MIT, to bring in these best practices around education reform. And what I observe is that while these ideas percolated at the very high levels, they didn't make their way down to the local level because bureaucrats were much more responsive to legalistic approaches. So they disciplined teachers, and if teachers were seen to deviate from the school curriculum, they were less capable of, they were basically given some kind of warnings. They were pressured by the local bureaucrats not to adopt these new policies, these new practices in the classroom, which were much more built around flexibility, teaching at the right level, as it's called, so putting children into groups and making it a much more participatory approach to teaching. In some sense, what you see in Bihar is what I call a kind of halfway transition. It's a reform that kind of gets the schools built. It gets teachers hired, but it doesn't get that motivation to change pedagogy inside the classroom. And so this requires not just having elite actors at the top participating in reform, but getting buy-in from teachers, for example. And so that is what I see as a missing piece, which is deliberation with local level actors in the process of implementing the reforms.
Thank you so much. Are there more questions? Otherwise, I can get to my policy questions as well. But please feel free to raise your hands or type in your questions on the chat. We'll address them. Professor Mangla, maybe I can come back to my questions then. I wanted to just ask you, what you think are the kind of broader implications from your book for implementing education policy. What lessons does the book offer about scaling up education reforms in an equitable fashion? And I think you've already spoken a little bit about the role of power in politics, but if you could just talk about the policy impact of this book, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So, I try to think about, what is this, this type of study have to say about education policy. And I think at a very broad level, I think it points out that that actually when we look at education, it's a very complex service to provide. It's very challenging. I mean, any of us who's had a great teacher, I mean, I hope we've all had one. It's such an inspiring thing to have that teacher. And often what that teacher was doing was not just going by the lesson plan, but doing something above and beyond the call of duty. Often it required that teacher to be motivated to show us something that the standard curriculum didn't show us, or sometimes even arguing against the standard curriculum. And so if we begin thinking about that very complex interaction that has to take place between teachers and students and communities to get quality education delivered, if we begin from there, we can see that it's not enough just to think about, for example, the scale up of a reform without regards to the relationships between people. So between teachers and students, between teachers and the community, and then between the bureaucracy and all of these actors on the ground. And so our models of scale up, I would argue the book suggests, need to go beyond thinking about scale just in terms of size and expansion. And this is a very economic approach to scale, which kind of builds on this, trying to reduce your cost and expand, treating as if the world is almost uniform in terms of its geography and its social environment. Once you recognize the vast varieties of local norms, local needs, geography, we realize that actually scale up is not just about expansion, but also thinking about differentiation and adaptation across different places. And this requires a very different set of capabilities from what we normally expect states to have. Like the traditional policy advice that's been given to developing countries over the past 30 years, you could say, has been about how do you cut back on corruption? How do you ensure bureaucrats don't have too much discretion? How do you limit the amount of resources you give to bureaucrats and encourage them to meet certain targets that are often being set by, say, policymakers in Washington, D.C. or in London or in New Delhi, for that matter? What I argue is that actually what we need to do is be less prescriptive from the top, but rather the sort of agencies that are overseeing education reforms should be much more enabling rather than prescriptive. Provide broad guidelines, provide some ideas of what outcomes you may want, but give some freedom at the local level to adopt those guidelines in sync with local needs and local challenges. And so that process is much more messy. It's much more conflictual. It requires discussion across levels of the state, and perhaps is less comfortable to policymakers because it makes you recognize you don't have all the power at the end of the day. In fact, you need to get local level actors involved, and those local level actors need to get communities involved. And so my sort of policy recommendations that come out of the book are, how do we strengthen that sort of process of discussion and deliberation? So it's more about scaling up the mode of governance rather than scaling up any particular one policy that's a silver bullet. In fact, I argue against a silver bullet approach to education because education is simply too complex. There's not one technology or one size fits all policy or program that can get everyone to learn. And ultimately, the challenge with a lot of education reform, as I read the literature, is that it's actually demotivated teachers on the front lines by really disempowering them in the process of decision making. And so part of this is also, how do we build trust? How do we build trust across levels of government such that we're willing to give some flexibility to actors at the local level while encouraging them to be accountable? But accountability is not just about meeting prescriptions, but actually having what other scholars like Lan Pritchett, Dan Honig, and Yamini Iyer at CPR have called accounting and giving an account through your discussions of what it is that you're trying to do with the resources you have and what are the challenges you're facing. And I think deliberation is much better suited to giving an account rather than simply checking boxes on a compliance list being pushed down by policymakers.
Thank you so much. As Andy has also written down one line that you said, scaling up is not just about expansion, but about variation and differentiation, which I think is a really useful one to remember. There's also a question by Andy. He says, I would love to know more about how states enforce curriculum compliance. Who enforces this exactly, and how does it happen?
Yeah, so this is a great, interesting part of education reform in India, where there have been national curricular frameworks developed. So if you think about it, right, India is like a collection of countries, and yet there's a national curricular framework. So part of the pressure is coming from New Delhi that we need to nationalize education in some way. Right? Fine, fair enough. You may want to have some national standards, but then the pressure comes down to state governments to demonstrate that they're doing things that are in consonance with the national curriculum. So there's state curricular frameworks that get developed, and that happens through the education bureaucracy. But the way it gets meted down to the teacher is that you'll have a district education office, which is then reinforcing fulfilling a curriculum. And so school inspections are often used as a way to check. So for example, school teachers, have you completed the curriculum up to this month? Show us in your diary, in your teaching diary. And I actually joined officials on their monitoring visits to schools to understand their local interactions and governance practices in interaction with teachers. And often it was around, have you completed the curriculum? Show us that you've done so. And if you're diverging or departing from the curriculum, that's frowned upon. So teachers who are not doing that are given stern warnings not to do that. So in some sense, that discipline that starts from, say, the very top gets meted down to the local level. And in fact, teachers themselves will say in interviews that I had collected, that we would like to do X, but we're told to do Y. And that Y is to meet the curriculum requirements, ensure that the registers are filled properly, so all the administrative documents. And in fact, teaching is just seen as an extension of administration. It's not treated as a distinct task that requires a very different approach and set of skills and so on and so forth. So in some sense, the discipline of the bureaucracy down to the local level is imposed on the teacher. And the teacher sees their job very much as I have to show that I'm fulfilling the curricular requirements. So in some sense, you could see how the chain of command goes down the bureaucratic hierarchy, and then it eventually finds its way into the school. And so some teachers, they find ways to work around that. They find ways to provide additional teaching services. Often this is the growth of private tutoring services, which is for profit, or it can be their own efforts independently. But when they're doing this, they're often working against the law, and they're working against the standard curriculum that's meted down, by the school administration.
Thank you, Professor Mangla. We are coming to sort of the end of our session, but I wanted to end with a sort of forward-looking question around policy again, and we can wrap up with that discussion. But of course, we had a new education policy in 2020. Also, last month, the new national curricular framework also came out after so many years, after 2005, I think, for the first time, but only for foundational stages. So I was wondering what lessons your book sort of has as this new policy gets implemented, as the new NCF gets implemented. How would you advise central agencies to sort of administer and implement this policy based on your findings in your research?
Right. Thanks for that. So yeah, India is at this kind of crossroads, and in fact, many countries are at a crossroads of education. And I think some of what I'll say is building off of some of the questions, the great questions that were already asked, which is how do we think about reform down at the state level? So when I look at India's national education policy, I think this is an important document. It really shifts the focus from inputs to learning. So learning is seen as really the central key area to address, and quality is addressed. So the policy is actually quite honest in recognizing very big gaps in the quality of services. So I actually think that's a healthy sign that the state is able to critique itself by recognizing this. And then focusing on foundational learning. And I think that's also quite important. So this is a moment where the state, the central government is really trying to encourage this shift. I think what this policy demands is a lot more than what we currently have in place in terms of state capacity. So a couple of pieces of what this policy says, and I'm focusing on primary and school education, not on higher education. The policy has a lot to say about that as well. But one aspect of the policy is to encourage pre-primary education. So it's clear that parents want their children in school much earlier. In fact, those who are wealthy have been sending their kids to preschool for quite a while now. And this is happening all across the world. There's a big conversation. I mean, I'm sitting here in the UK, big conversation around making pre-primary education much more central, state support for it. These conversations are happening in other, more developed countries as well. In India, this idea that children's early child development is really important to prepare them for learning at the foundational levels is recognized by the policy. I think where my book comes in with some hopefully some useful ideas is how do you actually operationalize that? So if you look at what pre-primary education involves, at this stage, what it involves is actually working not with just the education department, but also with the Department of Rural Development, which has developed Anganwadi centers. And these are centers for early child nutrition, health, and so on. And do these departments talk to each other? Is the Anganwadi worker who is already front-loaded and overloaded with a whole range of other tasks, given the bandwidth and the skills and the training and the identity to be professionalized as a preschool teacher? I think those are really massive questions that ought to be addressed. And I think one way of addressing it that my book offers is to encourage a lot more intensive deliberation across departments. So one would be to have departments like rural development, education, and say a department like Department of Women and Child Development, which are kind of working on different aspects of the child, which holistically together would probably all together help with child education. Get them to talk to each other and find ways to coordinate more effectively, because the worst thing would be if this just gets this new task of teaching at the pre-primary level just gets thrown at a frontline worker like an Anganwadi worker, who, by the way, is probably underpaid and overworked, and then asking that person to deliver on getting children learning ready for primary school is a tall order. So I think that kind of level of coordination is going to be necessary. But then when you think about it, it also requires a change in how the central government sees itself vis-a-vis state governments. I would urge the central government to be less prescriptive and much more flexible, and, like I said earlier, provide a much more enabling environment for states to take the parts of this national policy that fit with the political, social context of those states and mobilize them and motivate them to integrate that into their everyday frameworks within the state government. And this will require the central government perhaps to create a platform that's, again, I would say far more deliberative. So are there lessons, say, from Himachal Pradesh that can be drawn out and shared with other states? And maybe some of those lessons need to be rejected because they don't work with other states. Maybe some of those lessons can be adapted to other states. But right now, there isn't that platform. This kind of policy learning is not happening across states. And I think the sort of quote that comes to mind is when I talk to a bureaucrat. In fact, a version of this has been stated across multiple interviews. Bureaucrats refer to India as a graveyard of pilots, that you're having all these individual pilots happening in different states and different locales. You have the central government prescribing policy, but it's often this kind of, you could say, disconnect between the central agencies and those perhaps successful, maybe unsuccessful pilots, and we're not learning from them. So I think this kind of platform for learning across different states could be yet another way to promote a more effective operationalization, implementation of a national policy on education. And the last piece I'll say, and I guess I'm just going to just reiterate myself, we need to make school teachers much more central into this conversation. So there's really good agencies involved in all of these conversations around education reform in India. Non-governmental agencies are involved, international agencies and experts are involved. It would be great to have a platform for teachers and understand what are their sources of motivation and demotivation, and actually operationalizing some of these ideas. So if it's foundational learning that we want, if children are not learning in the classroom, what are the things that teachers need what will help them to do their job better. We need to hear a lot more from teachers. And teachers, by the way, is a broad heterogeneous category. So we need to recognize that among teachers, there could be very different views about this. And so we would need to, again, perhaps I'm a broken record, would need to be deliberating with teachers far more robustly and at multiple levels. So this is a plea for state governments to work much more closely with teachers associations and with teachers in trying to operationalize some of this, the policy recommendations.
Thank you so much, Professor Mangla. I think you've given us some really important points to take away and think about. And I do hope that we can move past the stage of piloting and then, I hope some of these can be incorporated in policy implementation going forward. Thank you so much once again for sharing your work, your insights with us. It's been extremely enriching for all of us, I'm sure. I also want to thank Marva from Indocs, who's here with us, who made this session possible. Thank you so much, Indocs, for supporting us and collaborating on these seminar series. I think it just sort of expands the kind of knowledge we can bring to this network. And thank you all of you who are here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for asking questions. We did go live on YouTube as well. So this session will remain recorded on YouTube. We'll share the link with everyone. Please do share it with others who may have missed the session. You can join our mailing list. We have some other interesting sessions coming up next month as well. So I hope we keep seeing you, and do follow us on social media. We're at Ed South Asia. And I hope you all enjoyed the session and will keep in touch with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Mangla, again for being here.
Thank you so much for the conversation, and the audience, I really appreciate your questions. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you.